Hi everybody, and welcome to this video called Understanding Christmas. If you're wanting to know more about the origins of Christmas and how we got to where we are today, I've put together a couple slides with some interesting facts about what transpired in the past to basically become what is Christmas today. It is quite a history lesson, but you need to understand the history in order to understand how we ended up where we are today. I thought before I would get into the facts and the history, I wanted to remind everyone of the verses in Ezekiel where the Lord was taking Ezekiel and showing him all these abominations, specifically the last abomination where he said, look at the 25 men with their back to God and their faces toward the east, worshipping the sun. This is going to be important later. So I thought I would start with the festival of Saturnalia. Saturnalia was a Roman feast dedicated to the god Saturn, which was in the Roman pantheon the god of the harvest, and it was started anywhere from at least 500 BC because and I'll show you some references in ancient documents where it was already being practiced, and so I can't tell you when it exactly started, but I know that it was being practiced at least 500 years before Jesus was on earth. So I'll read a bit about it over here. Saturnalia was an ancient Roman festival in honor of the god Saturn, held on the 17th of December of the Julian calendar, and later expanded with festivities through to the 23rd of December. The holiday was celebrated with a sacrifice at the temple of Saturn in the Roman Forum and a public banquet followed by a private gift-giving, continual partying, and a carnival atmosphere that overturned Roman social norms. Gambling was permitted, and masters provided table service for their slaves, as it was seen as a time of liberty for both slaves and freemen alike. So here is the reference from an ancient Roman historian. His name was Titus Livius, and it's a very common book that's referenced for anyone that's doing any research into ancient Rome, called Livy. You can see over here that he actually tells us that the festival of Saturnalia was celebrated soon after the Battle of Regulus. So we know in ancient history that this battle was fought between the Romans and the Latin League at least 496 BC. So this is just to give you context in history where Saturnalia was already being practiced. I've also got a slightly more in-depth description of what was happening in Saturnalia's festivities, so I'm going to just read through this. Saturnalia festivities began with a ritual and sacrifices in the temple of Saturn. The statue of the god was hollow and filled with olive oil as a symbol of his agricultural functions. Many of the decorations involved greenery, swathes, garlands, wreaths, etc., being hung over doorways and windows and ornamenting stairs. Ornaments in the trees included sun symbols, stars, and faces of the god Janus. Trees were not brought indoors. That was the Germans which started that tradition, but they were decorated where they grew. Food was also a primary decoration. Gilded cakes in a variety of shapes were quite popular, and children and birds vied for the privilege of denuding the trees of their treats. The commonest shapes were fertility symbols, and I don't think I have to go into more detail about those symbols. Suns and moons and stars, baby shapes, and herd animal shapes. Although, to be honest, it's hard to tell if some of those ancient cookie cutters are supposed to be goats or deer. I would imagine coins were also popular decorations or gifts. The biggest part of Saturnalia was the attitude more than the decoration. Feasting, drunkenness, and merrymaking, hopefully the conception of more children pranks, gift-giving, role reversals, which was symbolic. So, for example, slaves weren't really free to make a free man's decision, and anything they did or decreed would be reversed at the end of Saturnalia. And children weren't really adults and could not enter into any binding contracts, and so forth. I thought it would also be useful just to highlight, for those that don't know, a bit of the history of the transition between the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire. So, from contact with the Greek world, Rome received its heritage of religion, among other things, where Rome would eventually imitate the Greek pantheon, adopting it to its own forms. Jupiter would become Zeus, Juno, Zeus's wife Hera, and Mars would become Ares, Minerva, Athena, Bacchus, Liber, and so on. So Roman gods would even acquire the outward representation of their Greek counterparts, their personal characteristics, their family relationships, and their legends. So they would appropriate the gods of the Greek pantheon that would become the Roman. And I think most people understand this, but in a spiritual context, you've got to understand why this is important. So let's discuss the actual date, the 25th of December. This was the day that the Romans worshipped and celebrated Sol Invictus, which was the unconquered sun. And it was their sun god. And keep in mind, remember what I said about the book of Ezekiel, how the 25 men worshipped the sun. I wondered why 25 men. And obviously, when I read this and I understood that that was a reference to this day of celebration that would mark our history for an eternity. And you need to also understand that Sol Invictus was appropriated from the Greek gods, and the original god was Apollo. And if you read in the book of Revelation, it talks about how, and they had a king over them, which is the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in the Hebrew tongue is Abaddon, but in the Greek tongue hath his name Apollyon. I know that there are people that dispute that Apollo and Apollyon are the same, and it's a different reference, but I have found other authors have also found and researched that Apollo was used and interchanged between Apollyon in the Greek history. So, for example, there's a reference over here where Webster's dictionary points out that Apollyon was a common variant of Apollo throughout history. So how did the 25th of December become Christmas Day? Well, in 330 AD, the celebration of the Christian Christmas was introduced for the first time. Think of that, 330 years after Jesus died and rose from the dead, with an imperial decree by Constantine overlapping and or replacing the pagan holiday of the Dies Natalis Solis Invictus. From Constantine onwards, the figure of Christ was in fact considered by the empire the most suitable new religion for social control, and was identified with that of the Son to be better accepted by the masses, especially the legionnaires who at the time were largely followers of Mithraism. In this way, the birth of Christ was moved to 25th of December to make it coincide with the birthday of the sun god, and the birthday of the Son became the birthday of Christ. In 337, Pope Julius I formalized the date for Christmas for the Christian Church. And you can see on the copy of this calendar on the left, even in the year 354, the festival of Saturnalia and the day of celebration to Solus Invictus was still the primary days of celebration. It probably took another couple decades before the day of Christmas became the primary day of celebration on the 25th. But you need to understand that this day was really just appropriated. it was taken over so that people could simply be absorbed into a religion. I also thought it would be important to mention Antiochus Epiphanes. This was a Greek king mentioned in the book of Maccabees, and he persecuted the Jews relentlessly. They actually called him the wicked. And I got this citation out of basically a dissertation that was written by a university master's student that wrote a thesis on this Antiochus Epiphanes. So it was historical in nature, but it shows the history that's tied to the Bible, and specifically around an event that happened, which is why I'm bringing it up, was there was a point during his persecution of the Jews that he actually went into God's temple and he desecrated the temple by sacrificing to his God. And, you know, I've read two different accounts, one where it said that he had sacrificed to Zeus and the other to Apollyon. You know, at this point, I think most of us should understand different God names, same fallen angel, same cherub. So and in particular, he finds out that this was also done on the 25th of December. And you can go and read it in the book of Maccabees. If you go and find a apocrypha version, it talks about in 2 Maccabees 10 verse 5, where now upon the same day that the strangers profaned the temple, on the very same day it was cleansed again, even the 25th day of the same month, which is Kislev, or Kislev in the Jewish calendar. So now I'm going to address the Christmas tree and why it's important to recognize this. So when I was reading Jeremiah 10, you get this verse where it says, "Hear ye the word which the Lord speaketh unto you, O house of Israel. Thus saith the Lord, learn not the way of the heathen, and be not dismayed at the signs of heaven, for the heathen are dismayed at them. For the customs of the people are vain. For one cutteth the tree out of the forest, the work of the hands of the workman with the axe. They deck it with silver and with gold, they fasten it with nails and with hammers, that it move not." Now, I immediately recognize this as a Christmas tree, and I've heard many people debate and give different versions of what they perceive this to be telling us. I honestly think that you are just deceiving yourself if you can't see that this is what God was warning us about. And he specifically says, you know, learn not the way of the heathen, and the customs of the people are vain. The customs. And this is something you're going to see which was appropriated from pagans or heathens that used to worship other gods, that ultimately became the symbols and the instruments that are now being used by Christians. And I will show you later where I believe that it's something that I don't think God likes very much. So before I go straight to the origins of the oak, Thor's oak and the Christmas tree, I also thought it would be important to mention the relevance of groves. The Old Testament talks about these groves quite a lot, actually, because they were used extensively as places to do rituals and to do sacrifices to the old ancient gods. And I have an excerpt here from a person that wrote a bit about what the groves were used for in sort of antiquity. And it says that the sacred grove, as a feature of physical geography, was also related to the placing of the sanctuaries, the veneration for deities, and the existence of a vibrant life, according to Madeline Jost. She also states that certain divinities prefer one type of terrain over another. For example, Artemis, a goddess of agriculture and childbirth, sometimes can be found in groves in the countryside. In this case, sacred groves can be seen as objects of vitality and veneration, and mediators that connect the goddess and the human being. And I wanted to mention that about the groves because the German origins of the Thor's oak is tied to groves. And it talks about how, and well, trees in general. It says that trees hold a particular role in the Germanic paganism and the mythology, where both individual trees like a Thor's oak and the sacred groves, groups of trees. So the Thor's oak was a tree that they would basically perform rituals and sacrifice animals and at times children or people to Thor. And it talks about how after Christianization, trees continued to play a significant role in the Germanic people. And just again to re-emphasize, that the Christmas tree did in fact come from this practice, specifically of the Germanic origins. You can find plenty of references for this, where it says a Christmas tree is a decorated tree, usually an evergreen conifer or pine or fir, or at times an artificial version of it, where it says that the origins are from Northern Europe, and specifically it acquired its popularity during the second half of the 19th century. So it really only became popular in the recent, sort of last century. This is so important for people to realize. This hasn't been around forever. And I'll give you another reference now for that. Again, if you want to just confirm this, you just Google the Christmas tree in Wikipedia, and it tells us roughly when they started to be introduced into Christmas celebrations around sort of 1600. Now, when I just spoke about the last 100 years, I'm talking about widespread use of the Christmas tree. This was introduced in the Germanic areas around the 1600s. But it makes it clear to us, if you read it, says it was once a pagan tradition unassociated with Christmas traditions. Okay, so it definitely didn't come from anything to do with God or the Bible. And I thought that I would just end over here with the tree, specifically on the Word of God, where we read about it in Deuteronomy 60, verse 21. Thou shalt not plant thee a grove of any trees near unto the altar of thy Lord thy God, which thou shalt make thee. Neither shalt thou set up any image. So, for me, when I read that, it's like the image is something like the fake plastic ones. Don't put that next to God, which the Lord thy God hateth. I believe he hates the Christmas tree. Isaiah 1:28, and the destruction of the transgressors and of the sinners shall be together, and they that forsake the Lord shall be consumed. For they shall be ashamed of the oaks which ye have desired, and ye shall be confounded for the gardens that ye have chosen. Isaiah 17, verse 7. At that day shall a man look to his master, and his eyes shall have respect to the Holy One of Israel. And he shall not look to the altars, the work of his hands, neither shall respect that which his fingers have made, either the groves or the images. Again, I believe this is just in an instant. People are going to recognize and see the true living God, and immediately it's going to be revealed to them the deception that they've been basically putting Christmas as an idol before God. And I will pluck up thy groves out of the midst of thee, so will I destroy thy cities, and I will execute vengeance in anger and fury upon the heathen, such as they have not heard. And another reference that I thought was important was out of the book of Revelation, 11 verses 9 to 11. It talks about the two witnesses. It says, and they of the people and kindreds and tongues and nations shall see their dead bodies 3 days and a half, and shall not suffer their dead bodies to be put in graves. And they that dwell upon the earth shall rejoice over them, and make merry, and shall send gifts one to another. because these two prophets tormented them that dwelt on the earth. I don't know when you know of another time where people are being merry and sharing gifts, but again, I was very convicted when I read this, and I immediately believed that this was referring to Christmas before I even knew half of the things that I've just presented to you. And I have a friend that I tried sharing some of this with, and he said something to me kind of like this, where he said that, you know what, I don't know about all this pagan stuff. I know I worship Jesus. I love Jesus. So all these other things, I don't care about it, but it doesn't matter. And I believe it does matter to God. And again, when I was reading in Exodus, and it specifically talks about the golden calf, this is what God has to say about putting up idols that represent his feasts and representing worshiping him. And it says, and he received them at their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool after he had made it a molten calf. And they said, these be thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. So Aaron basically, got the Israelites to gather all their gold, and he helped them make this calf. And when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made a proclamation and said, tomorrow is a feast to the Lord. Again, an image and basically a pagan or heathen idol that was set up, but worshipped as though it was part of God's worship. I can't see how it's any different from you taking a feast like Saturnalia, which worshipped the sun god, which is Apollyon, and then putting up Christmas trees, which were worshipping the god of thunder, Thor, lightning. And it tells us, and God tells us in Exodus 32 verse 7, and the Lord said unto Moses, go thee down, for thy people which thou broughtest out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. He sees us as corrupting ourselves. And while I'm on this, it made me think when I read that story in the book of Maccabees, how that Greek king Antiochus had defiled the Lord's temple on the 25th of December. It was a physical thing. He had actually gone in and he had profaned it, and he had sacrificed to his God. To today, where we, the temple of God, are being profaned and being, in a way, defiled by worshiping our God in this manner, where it's just the origins and the roots of everything were, in essence, these ancient gods, which God was warning us about. And again, when I say ancient gods, it's all Satan and the fallen angels that were their holidays, their veneration, their days of worship. And if you believe that God would be okay with that, well, let's see. I don't believe so. I thought I would maybe just remind you that my God is a jealous God. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me. For thou shalt worship no other God, for the Lord whose name is jealous is a jealous God. So, I hope that this hasn't been too hard for most of you to hear, but it is something that I believe is important, especially in the period we're heading into. You need to start to see the world for what it is and understand that the battle has always been to separate the wheat and the tares. Those that worship the Lord and only our God Jesus, and those that are willing to compromise. Thanks very much.